My father was a pastor in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and he had a number of missionaries serving around the world in missions from that congregation. And one of the things I thought was missing as a kid, at least later as I came back to Coatesville, was I noticed a lot of the stores got boarded up and things had run down in the town. And I was thinking we were really good at sending missionaries out, but we ought to have had a few missionaries serving in Coatesville just to try to keep the economy going or the business going. Now, I'm sure my dad actually did that. It was probably circumstances of dealing with the steel industry and things like that. And I was talking to Dr. Clark this morning. He was at the early service. And you'll be seeing something in the way of an announcement in the church newsletter. And I had to explain something about it. Pastor Stacy Tate is a Presbyterian pastor serving in the UCC church in Irvington. And she wanted to take a mission trip to the Virgin Islands. And there's free funding for a free airline ticket if you have a Presbyterian pastor of a Presbyterian church sponsoring it. And so the person said, you've got to have a Presbyterian pastor. So she asked one Presbyterian pastor, would you sponsor it? No. Came to me, okay. So her 15 people will have a free ticket to the Virgin Islands to do the mission trip. And we just found out we have to tell them right away. So if anybody's interested in going on that mission trip, you'll have to call me like Wednesday or Thursday right away, because that's the deadline for getting the tickets that are being paid for. So I want to explain why the rush was that way. It was because we had no idea the tickets had to be secured so quickly. And Reverend Jeff Grote, who sponsors the program, he is talking to his Taylorville church about this for the first time this morning. So he's going to see if anybody in the Taylorville church was interested too. Anyway, the point Dr. Clark was making is, he says, Ed, I've gone off these other places. He's been to the Himalayas. He's been to the Amazon. He's been to Kenya and different places. But he says, the real missionaries are the people working in this community, people who are serving in different ways. And that's the real mission. And I totally agree with him. How we are, wherever we go, we are Christ love to our world. Now, life is challenging. Life is difficult. I had no idea how difficult life was until I became a pastor. I've come across diseases I've never heard of before and tragedies I haven't heard of before in the 3 congregations that I have served. And it's like, how do we get through life? Now, the college, I talked about him before, but I just love this David Mador. He's from Salem, and at age 18, he was a great golfer, and he was in a police car for fun, and he got in a high-speed chase, and the car crashed, and he became blind, age 18. The policeman had to actually move to Michigan because he was under so much criticism in Salem. Now, his book is called Broken Eyes, Unbroken Spirit, and Cascade College brought him out to inspire the students. In other words, if a blind person can create a great life, a life of service and a good life, we ought to look at our own challenges, and maybe they're not as difficult as David's challenge. Now, he's a really good speaker, and he loosens up the audience before the talk. As he begins the talk, he gets everybody to laugh. This is what he does. And he talks about it in the book, but I experienced it. He has a golf club, and he introduces himself, and there's a carpet where he can feel where he is. It's right in front of me. I was doing the opening prayer, and I'm sitting there at the table, and right there, and the carpet's right in front of me where he's a little mat where he has the golf club. And he picks it up and says, I'm going to show you my golf swing. And he goes like this, and I'm going, whoa! I am scooting that chair back, thinking, he's blind. He might hit me. And Travis Henson also was moving back, too. It was really funny. And all the audience just laughs. And he says, hey, I got Pastor Ed to move, didn't I? But that gets everybody relaxed, and he does that at every talk. He has it all worked out. I actually was not in any danger. But he has an inspiring talk about how he dealt with blindness. Now, he had to go to school in Chicago for blindness, and to pass the test, he had to walk the streets of Chicago and cross the roads. Now, I could hardly do that in Chicago. You know how people drive there and how the lights are. Here, he has to do that blind. And they give him an assignment of different places to go. And he has this walking stick, and he taps along where he's going. And after he got done, he didn't know it, but maybe 6 foot behind him was his teacher. But after he got done, he said to his teacher, "That was difficult." And she said, "David, life is difficult." That's really true. Life is difficult. And how do we come through life? How do we deal? And David's life got more challenging. Now, he went to school at Carbondale, and his tutor liked him, and they got married. But then he came down with a cancer called Hodgkin's disease. He's blind, and now he has to deal with disease, a cancer. Well, he overcomes that, and he builds his family. He sells life insurance, and he sets up a mission. His mission is to teach blind people how to golf, and to teach people who could hardly see how to golf. And he actually won a blind person tournament, but his mission is teaching the kids. You can still do things even though it looks like you're limited. Well, then he comes down with colon cancer, and it was really, really tough because he had a colostomy that could not be reversed. In other words, he'd always have a pouch the rest of his life. He could never go to the bathroom again. It's a hard time. And he has to deal with that. That was discouraging. But he says this at the close of his book, a wonderful piece. He takes 2 of his grandkids out to a park to play with all the equipment there. And the little girl asks for a drink. And he lifts her up. And it turns out she's 4 and the brother's probably 6. They're in a water fight. And everybody gets soaked. And then it gets chilly and windy and they're wet. Now think about this. He's blind. He has to walk through a playground. How do you do that? He keeps his walking stick up high so he doesn't bump his head into something. And he finally gets to some steps, and the kids cuddle close to him. Now remember, he's in a lot of trouble here. But as he waits for his daughter to return, as they were snuggling, he said it was magnificently cozy. The 3 of us huddled together, Granddad serving as a shelter, protecting them from the cold. My medical ailments, blind, Hodgkin's, colon cancer, my medical ailments suddenly seemed not so important. I knew I had plenty of life still to live, a family to love, and grandchildren to hug. And so he was so good talking to our students and to us about don't let obstacles stop you from your dreams or being in service. And today's Bible lesson is about a wonderful Jewish Christian who was in service. And the Bible says in Acts chapter 9, as John read it to us, there was a disciple in Joppa. What's a disciple? The apostle means you're sent out. We have the apostles class. And you'll see signs as we leave the church outside. We're entering the mission field. We're sent out from here. That's the apostle side. What's a disciple? Jesus says this in John 13. People can tell if I'm a disciple of His and you're a disciple of His if we're able to love the people in the church family. They're different from me. Am I loving that person? Am I accepting that person exactly as they are? Could I love that person? Jesus says, like I'm loving you, you are to love others, and that's my definition of a disciple, Jesus says. Oh, I thought when I was a kid it was different. In my dad's church, if you drank alcohol, This is a Coachville Presbyterian Church. If you smoked, no gambling, no going to dances. My sister in high school couldn't go to a dance. No dances. That's all out. That was the definition of a Christian. You don't do this, 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 and this. Jesus says no. It's how you love the people. In your heart, love them. By the way, if somebody was drinking, they had wine or a cocktail, they couldn't be on Dad's board. That was different. I think we'd be hurt a little bit in this church with our board. So the point is this. Are we able to love that person? And now, in Matthew 25, when Jesus has the great judgment day scene, this is his definition of a disciple. I was hungry. Jesus, was hungry, and you fed me. Jesus, was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. Jesus, didn't have the clothes, and you gave me the clothes. In other words, his definition in the judgment day is, could we actually see somebody in need, especially in the church family, and did we respond? And if I don't respond, I may have seen it, I don't respond. Jesus says, Ed, you're not being my disciple. It's the response. And so there was a disciple in Joppa that's on the Mediterranean Sea, right on the coast. It's a seaside town named Tabitha. And that translates gazelle. What a beautiful name. And the Bible says she was full of good works. Pretty good. Good works. Just like you. I've seen you working all over the town, or the hospital, or the college, or the grade school, or the high school, in the community. Good works. She was full of good works and acts of charity. Acts of love. Pretty good. She was really in service. She was really caring for people. She could see a need and out of her own skill and ability could respond. And then she dies. And what happens in my 43 years of being a pastor when somebody dies? Pastor, this person is so wonderful. This person did this for me. Or this person encouraged me this way. And you hear all the wonderful things. Well, I wonder if Tabitha heard it all. But they were so impressed, they sent for Peter, who was in the city of Lydia, about 15 miles away. Peter at this time is not hanging out in Jerusalem. It's too hot for him. James, the brother of Jesus, is now running that church. And Peter is called, and they bring Peter to Joppa to do the funeral. And they said, Peter, look what Tabitha did for me. And what did she do? The widow showed her coats that she made for them. In other words, Tabitha saw a widow, a person of low income, without provision. There's no Social Security then. And she sees that person needs a coat, and she's good at one thing especially. No sewing machines back then. She sews. That's her skill. And she takes her skill, perhaps some of her own financial resources, perhaps others in the church family are donating, and she makes a coat for that widow. And then there's another widow who needs a dress, and she makes a dress for that widow. Now, I want to say something here. Each little sewing stitch with that needle, what was that? That's love. Each little stitch. It's just a little act, but it's done with love. A heart that responds to a person in need, and she's sewing with love, and she is able to make, here's a dress for you. Oh, can you imagine how they felt? A dress for me? And look how fine it is. And it turns out she made a bunch of coats She made a bunch of dresses for the gals, for the widows, taking care of the needy. And that's the sign of the early church. They cared about each other. And if a person was poor in a hard spot, they cared about that person. It's just so inspiring. And she's so full of love. Well, what does Peter do? Everybody out. Peter prays over her. And he says this, 2 words. Tabitha, arise. What is going on? Tabitha, arise. She opens her eyes, she sits up, and Peter gives her his hand. She gets up. So, that's what you do in life. You give your hand to people. This is a hand with a heart. That's what she had. That's what Peter had. A helping hand for broken hearts, for people in a hard spot, people going through a hard time. We're not here to judge or put people down. We're here to restore and build up. The church family. It's a wider family of extra grandparents and uncles and aunts and grandchildren, extra ones for us to love. But each of you is a helping hand. We had a gentleman when I first came here in 1980, when I candidated, and his name was Mr. McLaughlin, and he was a postman. Now, his wife couldn't see. She sat in the pew. And what his ministry was, he walked around to everybody in church and said, "Good morning," to everybody. You came to church, he came around and greeted you. The funny thing, his wife didn't like him leaving her, but he did that. In another neighboring church, a person did that, and they said, "We don't do that here." So it's a different kind of climate. What Mr. McLaughlin was showing, hey, it's a hospitality. It's a place of caring and support. I think of another person, Walter Merkelbach, and Bernice was a real saint. She had rheumatoid arthritis and pain. You would come visit her, and she'd talk about you. She's just amazing. When she died, Walter was concerned about another individual in the church. And this gal was on welfare. Back then they had welfare. And she had a child who was in trouble with the law. And I've been talking with her about what we could do for the kid and for her. And I said to her, "You're really good at caregiving. You're really good at caring for others. Have you considered becoming a nurse?" Well, we got her enrolled at Kaskaskia College, and she got her practical nursing license. And but Walter says, "Hey, she's going to need money for books. Here's cash." Oh, Walter says, "Oh, Ed, she needs to have good shoes. You know, all that walking on the floor, you know, the nurse. Shoes. She needs a uniform, Pastor Ed." Uniform. He didn't, I can talk about it now because he's gone to heaven. But he was just caring for a person in the church family. And that's what you do. Different ones, people have different needs at different times. I want to share a very important quote. And it comes from Fred Rogers. You know, Mr. Rogers graduated from my seminary, Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He lived in Latrobe. He had a children's ministry. In fact, he asked Gabby Hayes, an old Western guy who had his own TV show, and he would show an old Western movie, and he would talk to the kids. And he says, Gabby, how do you do that? And Gabby says, "Well, Mr. Rogers, Fred, I just look in the camera, and I'm just talking to one buckaroo at a time." And that was his secret. And Mr. Rogers did that with his neighborhood. Anyway, he said this, and I'm talking about Boston now. "When I was a boy, and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me," oh, this is brilliant, "Look for the helpers." Scary things happen. Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. To this day, Fred says, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words. And I'm always comforted by realizing that there are so many helpers, So many caring people in this world. Well, Betty's family experienced that. We had two in the race, a nephew and a niece running in that race in Boston. And the nephew, he kind of pulled a muscle or something. He just couldn't do that well. So he did not go back to the finish line, which really was help for him not to be. But in all the confusion, all the cell phones are down. They finally found each other. And then they needed to get over to a friend's place. A classmate of Betty, and that classmate had died, but the kids were there with their grandkids. And we got to get there. It was like 80 minutes away. And a stranger said, I'm not going there, but I'll drive you there. There's a caring person. There's a crisis going along, and they're just trying to help. In some way, they're just helping. And they drove him those 80 minutes away, where the nephew and niece said to the parents, you go out, we'll babysit your kids. But the point is this. You're that role too. You're the helpers. In some way, you make a difference. In some way, you serve. And just like Tabitha, our church is enriched. But in closing, we ought to take a look. Before that Tabitha who's in our life dies, have we acknowledged her? Have we acknowledged him? Have we told her or him the difference they made in our life? And then also get this. You might not be thanked, but Jesus really appreciates when you, like Tabitha, do those little things like the sewing, stitch by stitch, but you do it with a lot of love. You are blessed, and you are a blessing. Amen.